I'd like to thank the folks from SSW for having me. My name's John. I'd like to say that I'm jealous of you all. When I was, I don't want to say your age, because I'm seeing some gray hair in the room, but when I was starting out, I'm sure Adam could say the same thing. We didn't have something as practical as this, the Fire Bootcamp. And when the folks at SSW told me about this idea, I thought, brilliant, this is awesome. So kudos to you guys for signing up for this course. I really hope that you guys are getting a lot out of it. It is really good to invest in your own skills and your own experience. And you do get a bit of that on the job, but I'm telling you from experience that getting best practices up front will save you heaps of time. And believe me, we laugh when we say it, but we've certainly hit our head against the wall many times, just struggling with problems. I don't want to sound preachy or kind of like, oh, you kids these days don't understand where we came from back in the day, but I got it myself when I was starting out from folks who had been in the industry for a while. So just part of the natural evolution, I guess, of our industry. Just a bit of background about me. I'm a principal developer advocate for Telerik. You may wonder what the hell does that mean. Basically, my role is to help you guys, developers, be better with our software. I do that in a number of different ways, but primarily it's through engagement. So writing blog posts, writing code samples, talking to you guys publicly at user groups, things like this. That's a lot of what I do. At Microsoft, I did a similar role for about 6 years, where I evangelized all things Microsoft, including Visual Studio, SQL Server, BizTalk, yes, BizTalk, and a whole dearth of other products, including SharePoint and others. So the thing I want to make sure is that you guys get something out of this today. I know you guys are busy. I know that you guys may wonder, like, why are we listening to me? So in the spirit of that context, I would like to put it to you guys that no questions off limits, including non-Microsoft stuff. I want to hear what you guys have to say. I want to hear what you guys have in terms of an opinion, because that's going to guide me in terms of giving you guys some practical advice. I am very much focused on the practical. I'm not very much on the academic. You may notice I don't have any slides, and that's intentional. Back in the day when I started, PowerPoint was a bit of a crutch for me. Now I just fire up in a text editor and websites. That's all I do. So no slides, and I hope that works well. I've taken some notes here on some of the things you guys highlighted in your retrospective. By the way, you may wonder, and I think you guys have maybe touched on this, the importance of a retrospective beyond just communication. For you guys individually, when you get out in the industry, it is going to be important to be an effective communicator to groups. And I don't know if you guys have touched on that, but public speaking is part of that. And we are no longer tied to our desks and just focusing on what's in front of us. We need to communicate effectively. That's going to help you immensely in your career. It separates a lot of folks in this industry, and I've seen it myself, the folks who go far in their career versus those who don't. So honing that skill, even though it may be awkward and uncomfortable, believe me, I'm an introvert. You want to see an introvert, look at my son. He's like me when I was 20 years old. So, but it does get better. It's kind of like that message of, don't worry, you'll get better, it's all good. So just like coding, it will get better. All right, so I've taken some notes of some of the things you guys like and didn't like. I've noticed that JavaScript and jQuery are listed, which is kind of interesting. Angular as a like is good, and we'll certainly touch on that. But before we begin, I do want to answer maybe questions that you guys may have. So I know it's a bit unusual to start with questions, but you guys have highlighted the fact that JavaScript and jQuery are in the dislike category maybe. Maybe we can try to address that. But do you guys have any questions you'd like to start with that maybe we can tackle to help guide this presentation? Because I have no agenda, by the way. I don't really have, I'm happy to go in the direction you want me to. So I'm a vessel for you guys to, exploit, if you will. But are there any questions on things that you're working with right now that you're struggling with? And that can include Visual Studio, that can include Microsoft Stack, anything. So anything at all? Don't be shy. So jQuery, maybe I'll propose one, what the heck? What do I need? What do I need to learn? What's the reality there, I guess? I don't know. Anything else? Any other questions?
I think one of the common sources of confusion
Yep.
And I've got Kendo.
Yep.
And you're telling me to use all of these things.
Yep. Okay, I'll talk about that, yeah. So I'll talk about frameworks, libraries, and the battle for the front end, I guess we'll call it. Any other things you guys would like to touch on specifically?
Yeah,
Dependency injection, okay. I may have to talk about that from a higher level perspective because I'm rocking a Mac here, and I know you guys are rocking Visual Studio, which is fine, by the way. So, but I'll talk about that certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, and just one more thing is dependency injection and how the Kendo UI like work with like with dependency injection. How does it work well with the dependency
Okay.
injection?
Yep. Sounds good. Okay.
Oh, Kendo plus Angular.
Kendo plus Angular. Yep.
Because just to put it in perspective, we did dependency injection server side using structure map and then
Yep.
repository unit works, all the C# stuff
Yep.
as a concept. But now we've had, and then we did Angular last week or the week before with Lavage.
Yep.
But Tatham came out on Monday. And
Did you guys cover anything like require.js or JavaScript components or okay?
he got to doing like Angular obviously is. So now when his presentation was more or less dependency injection and unit testing with Angular.
Okay.
So that's why we've had it now for both.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
I've done a bit of like Kendo work for the project we're working on. So we had a particular requirement. We got it over the line. But I'm coming from a forms background, the old way of doing things.
Yeah.
It's, sort of controls, server side, etc. So I'm looking at what Kendo brings to the table now with MVC. So I can sort of half work it out. We've got the MVC helper approach to sort of, rendering a grid.
Yep.
And then you can just go straight to HTML and do it all in, start from a table element and do it all in jQuery and JavaScript. So I suppose what's the magic rule in terms of
Okay.
obviously if we're working with MVC, we want to use MVC helpers, but when you start to leverage one over the other.
Sure. Yep. That's a good one. I can definitely cover that. By the way, just for transparency, I was part of the Kendo UI team for about 1.5 years, so I know Kendo pretty well. So, anything else you guys want to cover at all? Anything Visual Studio specific yet?
how to customize Bootstrap.
Customizing Bootstrap. All right, no worries. Yeah.
Yeah, we see there are not many frameworks in the market, means Angular with Ember.js and Knockout.js.
Yep.
So means how to decide to means to where we start work with us, how to decide about these frameworks, which is better and it's not that easy to start working with anyone. Means you are working with Angular and then you start moving with Knockout and
I guess that might be a way to kind of qualify it. Anything else? So I don't have as much time as I anticipated. I was anticipating a lot more time, so this will probably cover us well. Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm happy to tap dance as long as you want me. So it's all good. Okay.
Oh, yeah. My qualification, usually we do like a half-hour recording.
Yeah.
I like the TV recording.
Yeah.
We riff after that. So,
I think the TV stuff is fine for internal purposes, but like I said, my intention here is to help you guys. To hell with the TV stuff. Like no offense, but I'm just like I'd rather help these guys more than anything, so that they're that's what they're paying for, I guess. So that's right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. All right, where to begin? Let's talk a little bit about libraries. Because it's come up a couple of times now. You guys have obviously gotten a fire hose of information. And by the way, this is not uncommon, by the way. Any company you join, any new development process you incorporate, you're going to get a fire hose for at least 6 months. So just be ready when you take your next gig. It just takes a while to feel competent. There's a little bit of what's called imposter syndrome. Have you guys ever heard of that, imposter syndrome? It's basically this feeling you have internally, like I don't know enough, and how can they expect me to deliver? And I feel like they're paying me for just learning, and I'm an imposter, but no one's found me out yet. Don't worry, everyone goes through that. So there's a little bit of that going on in every aspect of this industry. In terms of libraries, there's a lot of choice out there. And one of the ways in which you can compare and contrast these two is there's a great project, I don't know if you guys have seen yet, called To Do MVC. Have you guys seen this yet? If you go to todomvc.com, this is a really good way of determining kind of what libraries might work for you. And what this is basically a litmus test that implement a to-do app. A to-do app is just basically like pick up the milk, buy the eggs, et cetera, et cetera. But what they've done here is they've done it, and they put it out to the community. They've said to the community, look, community, you've got a whole variety of different client-side frameworks out there. Go ahead and implement this to-do, very simple to-do application using one of the frameworks that you choose to use. And so we did something using Kendo UI. This is what it looks like, by the way, and the contrast is really wonked out here. So I don't know if you guys can you turn down the contrast at all a little bit? Because it's really white. It shouldn't look this white. But basically, the purpose of this is to provide a more practical example of here is sort of like hello world from a client-side perspective for a to-do app, and the implementation will differ based off that. So this is a really good way. You guys asked about libraries. I would say this would probably be one of the first locations I'd go to compare and contrast how things are done differently. So To Do MVC is exactly that. It's basically a means to discovering that. It might be brightness or one of those. There you go, perfect. That's actually a lot better. Awesome. Wicked. So the idea here is, travel to Sydney, and then speak at Fire Bootcamp. The idea is that what we have here is a front end, and underpinning that we have a model in Vue, and in some cases a Vue model, which I'm assuming you guys have learned as constructs. Yeah. Okay. Good. So. And this site really provides an idea of how these things are done or implemented differently. So you can go to any one of these apps that are implemented and get a sense of how it looks like in Angular versus Kendo versus etc. Intentionally, the UI is the same. That's intentional, right? Because a lot of people will get they'll glaze over when they look at the UI and they'll get confused. And so you can actually take a look at how this is done structurally. By simply looking at the source, which is really what you want when you start looking at this. So a lot of them point back to GitHub repos, and you can go ahead and inspect the source there. So that's one location you can go to for kind of doing a compare and contrast. That's actually probably the most practical example of comparing and contrasting libraries. Another place I might consider you guys should go is a site called microjs.com. This is a site that a lot of times you're comparing and contrasting libraries, and you're wondering, like, I just need a certain set of functionality, and maybe I don't want to use jQuery, and maybe I just want to use a micro library. Micro libraries are incredibly efficient because they're incredibly small. If you're worried about what hits the wire and how long it's going to take to propagate down to the client, what this does, it basically categorizes all of these micro frameworks that are available, and in addition to showing you what they do, they also tell you the size. So a lot of web developers are concerned, obviously, about the amount of data that gets pushed across the wire. So this is one site that you can go to. So if I needed something to manipulate the DOM, for example, these are some of the libraries. And I don't know if you guys have talked about Zepto at all, but provides a very compatible API that is very compatible with jQuery, but is extremely small, like 5 kilobytes. That being said, jQuery itself is it's on a slim fast diet right now, so it's actually it's shrinking a lot right now, so that's goodness. But this is another place that you could go to see how these libraries integrate. Now, the nature of JavaScript is that you will see competing libraries. You're going to see competing libraries on any number of levels, especially on the UI side. We have our own called Kendo UI. There are many others. There are any number of binding libraries. There are any number of libraries used for DOM manipulation. And in addition to that, there are a whole set of what are called polyfills. I don't know if you guys have talked about that yet. Polyfills are basically, they're like spackle. They're meant to bridge the gap that exists in older browsers that don't implement the latest and greatest specs. So this is a library called Modernizer. Have you guys talked about Modernizer yet?
We touched on it very
Okay,
briefly.
sorry. I know I'm jumping around, but I'm just talking about libraries in general. So Modernizer is a feature detection framework. Basically, it's basically there to tell you in JavaScript what the browser you're rendering in supports. So the idea is I'm a bit of code, I run on the browser, and then through Modernizer, I'm aware that I support WebSockets, or I support media queries, or I support XYZ. What they've done is they provided this very, as it says here, an all-in-one, entirely not alphabetical, no bullshit guide to HTML5 fallbacks. Fallbacks are a necessary evil. They are there to help mitigate the problem that often you'll hit in enterprise environments. When you guys go back and start implementing solutions for the enterprise, they're going to give you things like, they're going to give you parameters like, we have to support IE8 or IE6, God forbid. We have to get these things working. And unfortunately, a lot of your architecture may be dictated by those choices. Now with fallbacks, you have a kind of like a Band-Aid over top of those limitations. You can actually implement some of those specs, some of those features because of these libraries. The way that fallbacks work, or the way that polyfills work, is they are specifically designed in JavaScript to implement features and functionality that are missing from the browser. So one example would be SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, which we will talk about today because as we talk about Kendo UI, SVG is a major component of that. SVG is not implemented consistently across all browsers. Some of the older browsers like IE6 and IE5.5, they'll use VML, or they'll just be entirely missing feature sets. So there are fallbacks and there are libraries that you can use to help mitigate that problem. And this list is pretty good, depending upon what sort of features you wish to leverage. So these are all JavaScript libraries. They all implement various specs that are available, and they are there to help you get your job done. So this is another resource I would look at from a library's perspective. So we talked about MicroJS, we talked a little bit about to-do MVC, talked a little bit about polyfills. Some of the libraries that I will mention that bear mentioning, one is obviously Modernizer, which is the feature detection framework. This is useful on the client side because it's going to give you a sense of what's running on the client side. Don't rely on what's built in a lot of times with certain frameworks. You want something that's tried and tested, and Modernizer is pretty much the story going forward in terms of feature detection. Other frameworks that I would likely recommend, obviously jQuery is one which we don't really need to talk about too much, but jQuery is pretty big if you incorporate things like jQuery UI and others. But at its core, it's basically providing a set of library features that simplify your development process. Most people will identify with jQuery through the sort of $sign notation for a selector. So the idea is I can put within brackets here this expression which resolves to a DOM element. So for example, if I put div id equals foo, I can go ahead and qualify this based off the ID, and then from that I have an object that I can go ahead and plow method calls against. Nothing prevents me from working with the DOM API itself though. So if I don't need to, I could certainly use the DOM API that's built into pretty much every browser today to do the exact same thing. So I can query selector for this exact same element through the exact same means. There's an object called document which you can go ahead and query for. And the document object will allow you to do a lot of different things, such as creating elements dynamically, finding elements dynamically. And you can play around with this if you just bring up a set of dev tools that are available. You can go ahead and start plowing away against the method calls directly. On the browser side, I tend to use Chrome, but IE11 is actually really good. I would encourage you to use IE11. Firefox is good, but they all have different strengths. So I would say that Chrome's strengths are the dev tools. Firefox's strength are the dev tools as well. They actually have different aspects to the dev tools themselves. IE's strength is adherence to the spec. So if you really want to know if something will break or not, test it in IE first, because IE is actually extremely strict on the specs. IE11 in particular is extremely strict on the specifications, as well as Firefox. Firefox is extremely strict as well. The reality is you should have all three enabled, all three installed, and all three built into your development environment. Opera, not so much. Safari, obviously, if you're on a Mac, is built in. But yeah, that's just the reality today. You should be testing each one of them. There are tools that will help you simplify that process, which I'll talk about a little bit later if we have time. But you know, given the fact that you guys are just in this sort of learning phase, I won't bog you down with too much stuff. But the reality is, a lot of people will do this. This is the baseline test that we do. We test across browsers, as well as user agents, different user agents, such as mobile browsers as well. Have you guys talked about targeting mobile web at all?
A little bit.
Okay. All right.
Only a little bit of what's built into MVC.
Okay. Yeah. It just gets bigger and bigger. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts off small, and then by the time it gets to the bottom, it's just this enormous thing. But don't worry. It just happens, and you let inertia take over, and you'll fall into the pit of success, so to speak. So it will happen. So Modernizer is another library I would recommend. There are other ones that relate to JavaScript specifically. So Require.js is one. This is a way of being expressive in terms of your dependencies. So this is a library that you can use that will allow you to simplify your dependencies within JavaScript. And the reason why this is useful is because it basically takes away, it raises the bar of abstraction up one level. So rather than you know, worrying about which script includes are mentioned in your markup and what order they're in, you can use Require.js as a way of loading what are called modules, which is more or less a way in which we can describe libraries that are not going to collide and things like that. When I mention that, by the way, libraries that don't collide, that is a reality today. We don't have, you guys have talked about JavaScript a lot, but you guys are presumably working in C#, right? What do we have in C#? We have static typing, we have namespaces, we have strongly typed declarations. The compiler itself will check for collision. A lot of those things don't exist in JavaScript. JavaScript's a little bit, you know, obviously a lot more dynamic, but a lot more free-flowing, and that gives you a nice canvas to paint with, so to speak. But that being said, we miss out on a lot of stuff that we have in .NET today, this notion of components, self-expression, metadata, and things of that nature. Libraries like Require.js are trying to get us farther along the track. Angular is another example that's trying to get us down the track there with directives. You guys have covered directives with Angular, presumably? Okay. No? Okay. So we'll talk about, when we talk about Kendo and Angular and stuff, we'll talk a little bit about that. Just to confuse you even more, there's an awesome project that's underway called Polymer right now. This is from Google as well. So Angular is built by folks at Google. There are folks at Google working on this project called Polymer as well. This is not something that you'll use today. This will be something you may use in probably about a year or 2 years from now. Polymer is a means of implementing web components using polyfills and specs that are available from the W3C. Polymer itself is a combination of specs, and not to confuse you too much, but this is the architectural diagram for it. The stuff that you need to worry about is just down here. These are the specifications that are being implemented or being built right now by the W3C. These are things that you're going to see in the browser whether you know it or not that are important to understand. And Polymer is an opinionated library on top of those specs to give us what are called web components. The idea is that web components today really can't exist because browsers don't support all these specs, and so we use polyfills, as I mentioned before, in the form of Polymer to implement these things. The end output is we get some really nice looking markup. So if I take a look at the markup for the Polymer page itself, one of the things we'll typically see in a lot of sites are a lot of divs. So we'll see things like divs, and you get this div soup collection, right? Whether it's emitted or generated by MVC, ASP.NET MVC, or you write it yourself, you'll typically use these basic structures in markup, like divs, spans, ULs, LIs, etc. And it just looks like this soup of markup. With Polymer, we're able to create what are called custom elements. So custom elements are kind of like .NET types, if you want to make that association. This idea that I can give it a name, I can give it a set of behaviors, I can give it a structure, and with that I can declare it inside of my markup and then use it, reuse it over and over again. So with web components, we have this notion of encapsulation, we have reusability, so that's something that's coming down the wire. And I only mention it because in Angular right now, they're looking at Polymer as a baseline or a foundation for the future. So these two projects will slowly merge together. So again, giving you a little bit of theoretical / academic, but this is what's happening in the news today. And that brings me to another point, which is you have to keep on top of these things when they're happening in the industry. So I think you guys have covered the fact that you have to read RSS and make sure what's going on. Okay, good. All right, so.
We've asked nearly everyone though the question, what do you do to keep up to date?
Yeah, so the thing that I do is I go to a variety of sites. Anyone on Reddit at all? Yeah, cool. So /r/JavaScript, /r/WebDev. Twitter's a good place as well. You follow people who obviously know what they're talking about. Hacker News, despite I try to avoid the comments and just look at the links that are on the front page. Hacker News is its own entity, but tends to be a lot of good stuff there. There's a lot of things that I'll do that there's life hacks that I'll do. So if I'm interested in certain topics, I'll write certain alerts in Google. So this is a little life hack that I do. So if I'm interested in a particular topic, like say Kendo UI, I set up a Google alert for me, and it will send me an email every day or every hour or as it happens when these things occur. So if I'm interested in Angular, for example, then that might not be very descriptive. So if I were to put AngularJS, what this does is just every time there's something new on the web and the indexer of Google finds it, it will just send me an email. And that's one of the ways in which I keep up to date. It's more of a push process than a pull process. I used to use RSS back in the day when I started out like you guys. I used to subscribe to everything. And my unread count went up above 1,000, and it was just very demoralizing. I don't tend to read blogs anymore because I get those blog posts from links of aggregate sites that I see. There are a number of aggregate sites out there. Hacker News is just one of them. Alltop is another. Reddit is another. I would say use the curation process to your own benefit. Right? People will curate these sites with links, these link blogs, and they're really effective. Another one is JavaScript Weekly. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but if you go to javascriptweekly.com, this is a weekly email that comes out and highlights the latest and greatest. There's also an HTML5 weekly. I think there's a jQuery. No, I don't think there's a jQuery weekly, but there's a variety of sites out there. So basically, I opt in to those sources that I deem to be authoritative on the subjects I'm interested in. And then I life hack around everything. So I use Google Alerts. I'll use other means as well. So if then that. I don't know if you guys have seen this service, but if then that is a service. IFTTT is basically it's like a rules engine for stuff that happens on the internet that you can be notified of. So it's kind of interesting what you can do with this service, but basically it allows you to, it has these plugins, so you can do things like if something happens in say Facebook or in my email or a service that's publicly available, then do these certain actions. So there's a variety of what are called channels are part of this, and you can see these channels relate to things that you may yourself go to, like Blogger, Buffer, Evernote, etc. A lot of these are productivity hacks, but some of them are effective of gaining information or insights about news that's happening. So one example might be RSS. So there are a variety of what are called recipes that allow you to do interesting things. So these are examples. Email me an invite when a new startup is featured on beta list. Add new movie releases to my Google Calendar. So it's like programming the web in effect. And it's a service that you can use to hack your way around of getting more information about what's happening in the industry. So that's another thing I do. So, but you'll find what works for you. All right, so we've gone down that rat hole. We'll come back up for air. So those are some of the libraries that I would recommend. The reality is that usually the ones that bear mentioning are the ones that will bubble up to the top. So you guys have talked about Angular, which is good. Angular is eating the world, by the way, right now. Angular is, it's like Angular, Bootstrap, Knockout to a certain extent, but certainly Bootstrap and Angular are two of the most popular ones that I come across with customers, day in, day out. And you'll find that a lot of these frameworks are intentionally implementing feature sets outside of their main modus operandi, and the reason why is because they're trying to gain more eyeballs. So you look at a framework like Bootstrap, for example, and Bootstrap provides a lot of really interesting aspects for front-end web dev. So it provides a grid system, it provides some JavaScript niceties, it provides a consistent set of UI themes and layers, but it also provides these UI building blocks. Like it provides pop-ups and nav pills and all these sort of things that you kind of wonder, like, why would I use this? You have to remember the intention of Bootstrap from Twitter is for Twitter itself. They just naturally open sourced it as part of that process. But that's where these discussions around why you would use certain libraries over another really comes into play. So, I would argue maybe quite strongly that instead of using some of the UI elements that you see here, you could replace some of these with, say, Kendo UI or with some other UI framework that you enjoy. It really does require you to look at how they implement these things and then make an informed decision as to what you want to go with. A lot of times the answer is not obvious. So these libraries themselves are out there, and the answer, whether or not you should use the library or not, is not obvious. It's more of a gut feel, and more often than not, the best thing you can do is prototype. Write a prototype, write hello world, write to-do MVC, and get that going in that way. So Bootstrap itself is popular. Angular is very popular. I think we've covered the library stuff quite a bit, so definitely worth noting. Just a brief word on TypeScript. It's an interesting project. I don't know how strong it will take off in the community itself, but it is a good way of validating your existing JavaScript. One of the hacks I've seen people do is they take their existing JavaScript, put it into the TypeScript interpreter, and then it's able to catch certain bugs that exist in people's implementation. Because you have this notion of going backwards and forwards in the TypeScript interpreter. So that helps a great deal. So definitely worth checking out. There are other tools as well that I would recommend that I'll just mention briefly. This one will probably help you a great deal, which is called JSLint. This was written quite a while ago by Douglas Crawford, who's one of the authorities on JavaScript. And he wrote JavaScript, The Good Parts. Have you guys heard of that book yet? Okay, this is probably one of the first books you'll want to purchase. This is the definitive guide to JavaScript. Just look for this one. It's an O'Reilly book, so it has an animal on the cover. They all do. So it has this nice animal here. And this was written quite a while ago, and is sort of the Bible, if you will, when talking about JavaScript. It's rather thin, so it's not a huge book, so it's a quick read. But it does cover a lot of the great stuff that is in JavaScript. Anyways, Douglas Crawford wrote this tool called JSLint, and it's a linter. A linter is basically a parsing tool that will also check for certain validation rules. And so if you look down here, it has all these validation rules for things like assuming whether or not you're running within a browser or not, assume that you have certain root objects that you can write to, like the console or the alert. Assume certain tolerances, like, for example, double equals versus triple equals. You guys have learned that harsh lesson. Tolerate certain calls that are being made to certain aspects of the language. So you can take any part JavaScript here and dump it into. So let's take an example like to do MVC, and let's take, say, our implementation, and let's take a snippet of that. Let's take a look at the JS here. And what this does is it basically lints your, say raw. It just lints the JavaScript itself and then provides all these basically syntax checking and a variety of other things. It will give you warnings as to things that it found were problematic. It's not a compiler. So that I want to make that clear. It's not a compiler. It is a rules validation linter, if you will. So a linter is different. It's just checking it's not checking the validation against, certain types need to be used certain ways, nullity, things like that. It's rather just looking at the text of your code and saying, does it validate or invalidate any rules that we have predefined? It's a great tool. There's a implementation that integrates with VS. JS Hint is sort of an evolution of this as well, but there is if you go look at the Visual Studio Gallery, there's a tool that will integrate with Visual Studio on builds. So if you do a build run inside of Visual Studio, you can have JS Hint syntactically check your JavaScript, and will actually propagate errors to the error window itself. So definitely worth noting. All right, so we've gone down that rat hole. So let's now jump back to kind of the stuff that you guys are working on, which is Kendo UI. You guys are just focused on Kendo UI Web. Are you guys doing anything with Kendo UI Mobile at all?
Just focusing on it.
Okay, cool. So Kendo UI Web is it's a lot of fun. It's got some really cool features to it. And I know you guys are using some of the server helpers, so I'll mention that. All right, so Kendo UI Web, or Kendo UI in general, is nothing more than a jQuery plugin. So jQuery has this support for what's called plugins. And the idea there is that if you follow this set of constraints and you load yourself a certain way, you can work within that sort of sphere of operation, which is jQuery. jQuery provides all kinds of baseline functionality, and we leverage a lot of that stuff. So they provide facilities for AJAX calls. They provide facilities for DOM tree manipulation. They provide query selector, all kinds of stuff. We will actually leverage those things as part of our widgets. So if you guys have if you guys have looked at data source binding at all, or calling back to the server with Kendo UI, a lot of that stuff will use jQuery under the covers. So we take a dependency on jQuery, but that's the only dependency we take. And the trick to being effective with Kendo UI is just understanding that everything is basically, there's a very similar pattern to the way in which you work with widgets in Kendo UI. Basically, you initialize and set property values on the prototype itself. So every widget that you see here has a set of default configuration values in the prototype, and that when you work with these, you start to understand kind of how they operate and how you can integrate them within your pages. Is anyone using Kendo UI strictly in the client-side sense? They're not using the server helpers at all?
I don't. So the guys, only a couple of the guys have actually used Kendo.
Oh, okay. My apologies. Okay.
So sorry. So it might be worthwhile just pointing out the difference between the MVC helpers and the client.
Sure. Okay. So that being said, let's just briefly back up one more step and talk a little bit about the widgets. The UI library is there to help you. It is there to make you more productive so that you don't spend a lot of your time building UI widgets. You really shouldn't, if you think about it. And if you are, guess what? You're no longer building the client solution. You're now a component vendor. Congratulations. But you're now in our business, and we have a lot of competitors. So, but it really does mean a lot if you can get over that hurdle of giving up control. A lot of developers are naturally inclined to feel like, I don't want to use a library that I can't build myself because I'm giving up control. It's okay. You can give up the control. And one of the ways you can do that is by using our library. So we have a lot of components built in. probably the more canonical ones that people will gravitate to are the grid, and that's simply because designers don't really interact with developers too much. And if you talk to a designer, they're very rarely going to use a grid. But it is the poor man's UI structure du jour for developers. Developers love grids, and our grids are great. And I'm not knocking on our grid implementation, but you won't see a lot of designers using them, just simply because they have different feelings about those things. But the way that our grid works is that it's basically an in-memory structure that will render itself, as you see here. We have support for all kinds of facilities in the grid itself, like templates, so you can customize the look and feel. You can do a variety of interesting configurations for the grid itself. So we have this notion of what's called hierarchy, where you can have this sort of parent-child relationship embedded within the grid. And all the grids themselves support a baseline set of functionalities, so things like sorting, filtering, reordering, columns freezing, all kinds of things. So I can page through the various items in this child grid. You'll notice here that we're actually just doing an AJAX call. We're not posting back to the server and doing a full round trip. In addition to that, I can also do sorting on the various columns. And I can do a variety of other operations as well. I can do aggregates. So by example, we can auto-compute aggregates. So in this instance here, we'll group these items here, provide a count, an average, etc. We provide filters. So these are things that you can implement on the column itself. So if I want to say I'm looking for anything that starts with, say, Tacoma, and I can filter that out. This is all done client-side. Nothing's going back to the server in many instances. It's very efficient on the wire. We only send what we need to back to the server. And more often than not, we send deltas. So we send what's changed, not the whole Megillah. So that's a grid. There are other controls as well. There are everything as big as a grid to everything as small as a button. So buttons are, you might think, well, why would I care? Well, buttons themselves can actually have some complexity to them, but they're there for your purpose. We have some more complex ones like the scheduler. So the scheduler is kind of like Outlook on a web page. We have the notion of events that can be scheduled and moved around. We can go ahead and filter these events. So if you're looking at implementing a scheduling system, this would be something that you could leverage. So UI control kits like ours provide these features so that you can get some really good integration within your apps. Some of the more common ones you'll see, tab strips, so the ability to segment your application into different tabs. A menu structure is very popular. You'll see this in many websites today. Usually at the header, you'll see a menu structure at the top, and then people can click at various locations of the grid. Now again, this is just using jQuery, but every widget is built with touch-first design built into it as a principle. So one of the things you have to concern yourself, obviously, is with how interaction occurs at the touch level. And there are nuances to that as well, because as you switch from user agent to user agent, touch events are done differently. This just makes your job much more fun, doesn't it? So, because in IE we have what are called pointer events, and in Firefox and Chrome we have touch events. So our widgets will respond to both, don't worry. But it is something you have to be conscious of. Now, those are the UI widgets, and I won't waste your time looking at each one, but what I want to do is focus briefly on the framework that underpins it, because this ties into the discussion we've had about libraries. Kendo UI is intentionally shipping with a set of framework primitives, things like a data source, things like MVVM support, things like globalization support, because our design goal is to make a library that doesn't rely on any other dependencies. One of the problems you will face, and this ties back to the question about libraries, is when you construct an app that builds on a lot of different dependencies, some of those dependencies can conflict. Even worse, if you update one of those dependencies, it's like a house of cards, the whole thing just tumbles down. So by design, Kendo UI is built with some of these framework facilities built into the library, despite the fact that those libraries exist elsewhere. One of the things you won't see, for example, in our framework is feature detection. A lot of people ask us, do you guys use Modernizer? And the answer is no, we don't. We've actually implemented our own. And so that's another example of how we try and provide these facilities in one library so you don't have to take dependencies on others. Despite the fact that I mentioned that library is actually a very good feature detection library. We eliminated that dependency on ourselves because we wanted to ensure that we had complete control. So we ship with an MVVM support built in. So you have this notion of being able to create what are called observables. Observable objects are those that will basically
We've talked MVC, I haven't explained MVVM.
okay. MVVM stands for model view view model. So this is yet another sort of design pattern you can talk about now. So this stands for model view view model. You might wonder what's the difference between a model and a view model and a view and a view model. So the model is basically the data structures that you have that typically map back to where they're stored. So they are the way in which you think about your objects. I don't know what you guys are building, but if I'll take a classic example. If you're building an accounting app and you have orders and customers, etc., you may think of your model in those terms. The view typically is the UI. If you think of MVC terms, it's basically the markup. It's that sort of thing. The view model is the in-between. The view model is important because oftentimes what you map out and structure at your database level or in your storage level, and I say storage intentionally because a lot of people don't use databases in their implementations. But whatever you decide to structure in your storage, which is your model, may not map one-to-one to your view. And so you need an in-between. You need a view model that will provide that facility. Moreover, a lot of frameworks that implement MVVM provide change management facilities. So it's important to note that when you're designing a UI framework, you often want to be notified of changes, right? Because you want to respond to those changes. And a lot of MVC frameworks will provide just that. So the view model also inherently has built into it or encapsulated within it an eventing system. So it can tell other parts of the view, hey, I've been updated, or the view can update it and it can propagate changes to other parts of the system. And that can occur either on the client side in JavaScript or on the server side in C# or in whatever language you're doing. It's a design pattern that we have in a lot of different languages. So MVC is a design pattern typically implemented on the server side, which stands for Model View Controller. And the idea there is that it obviously maps well to what you guys are doing with ASP.NET. And Model View View Model is something that you'll see at it's a different conceptual idea where it's more front-end focused. Does that make sense? Okay. So we have one built into Kendo UI. However, there are other ones as well. So Knockout is one example. There are many other client-side libraries that will actually implement this as well. But the idea here is that you'll construct a model, which is basically your JavaScript object that will, customer, order, whatever. I know they're so boring, but like it's the only thing that we can really talk about unless you guys are building something specific. And then we have a view model collection or entity, which is what we call an observable object. So in Kendo UI, we have this notion of what's called observable collections and observable objects. And you think about the name observable, what does that mean? It means that you can actually watch it, and it has the ability of watching. So it is our view model object that will be tied into that. And so it has the notion of built-in change management. It has the ability of binding directly to widgets and propagating change to and from the view model, and then filtering those down to the model, and then ultimately the storage that underpins it. So the way that this is a very contrived example that we have here, but on the left-hand side, we have a simple registration form, which is our first name, last name, and gender, and then our checkbox. On the right-hand side, we have the current state of our view model. So you'll see this in a lot of MVVM and NV star client-side libraries, where I can actually get the existing context. So Knockout's a great example of this. Knockout does the exact same. And the idea is I can actually bind these two things, the view and the view model, together and get change management occurring across those. The way we do this in Kendo UI, and you'll see this differently, but it's consistently done at the markup level through what are called data-attributes. Have you guys dealt with data-attributes yet? All right, cool. So more stuff to throw your way. I'm not trying to confuse you, but I'm trying to give you as much information I can so you can go from there. So data-attributes are basically like custom properties that you can put on markup. So they are there to basically provide a means for binding or defining properties on certain elements. So because the reality is the input tag doesn't have an attribute value pair called bind. It's not in the DOM specification. Nor does the select, nor does the UI element. They don't have these things. Nor do they have any this notion of custom attributes. The way that we typically do that is we would just hold all that state in JavaScript and then filter it down to the markup level at some point. Well, we can do that now with markup using data-attributes. Data-attributes allow you to define custom properties. So the way this works is you define data dash, and then whatever column comes after the data dash, you can define whatever you want. So you can define whatever you want, and then you can use and exploit those properties in any number of ways. You can pull them off using basic JavaScript means, but a lot of ways that they're being used today is UI libraries like Angular, like Ember, like Handlebars, like Kendo UI. They will use these attribute value pairs for part of their framework. This is by convention. They will say when you want to initialize a UI element, do it this way. This is the declarative way of doing it. The explicit way of doing it is all in JavaScript, of course, but the declarative way is using data-attributes. So it's a means to an end. So with that being said, we talked about MVVM support. The way in which we can bind these values is using this bind notation. And we provide inside here, we're basically saying, I wish to bind to the value property of the input element. So the value that's going to be reflected by the input tag is going to be this property that I'm going to ultimately bind to called first name. Where does first name come from? We'll see in a second. But that's how the framework itself ties things together. The way that this all ties together is in the underlying JavaScript, we create this what's called an observable, and we define its properties. So say first name, last name, various other things, as well as behavior. So we have state and behavior. You may have heard these two terms used to describe objects. We don't have objects in JavaScript. We have prototypes. Well, we don't have classes sorry, I should say be more specific. We don't have classes in JavaScript. We have prototypes, and there's subtle differences between the two. But we have the ability to define our prototype here, as well as the object, and then bind it directly. So we have here data and behavior, and then we bind that to the target element where we're basically defining all that markup. So in this instance here, we are using a query selector in jQuery to say target the form element. Inside that form element, you're going to find all of, there's my form element, you're going to find all of these data dash elements sprinkled with data dash. You just, you framework, Kendo UI, Ember, Angular, whatever, go find those and then bind directly to them. That's how a lot of this stuff is done in UI frameworks. So coming back to kind of full circle with to do MVC, a lot of these UI frameworks that you'll hit today, that's how they do their job. That's how they do a lot of their binding. Except for a select few. Some select fews will just say, screw markup, JavaScript for the win, do it all in JavaScript. What happens to those frameworks? Charles Darwin happens to those frameworks. Natural selection takes its course, and no one uses them, and they eventually die out. The reality is markup is here, it's here to stay. It's a good way of describing structure, and so a lot of people are using that as a binding mechanism for those frameworks. So that's giving you some insight here. I don't want to make this specifically Kendo UI focused, but what I'm trying to show you here is that these are intentional patterns. They're intentional because basically this is how the industry has kind of collectively decided this is the way that binding should be done in some respects. Now, this is also changing in the short-term future with the Polymer project that I talked about earlier. So Polymer, again, I want to kind of tie it back to how this thing's may change in the future. At some point in the future, if this is successful, web components, this will change. And certain things, certain aspects like UI frameworks and stuff, this won't be a input tag, but maybe a username element. But the binding itself will look similar. So that's the MVVM part of it. There are all kinds of other parts of it as well. But I think it might be a good time just to jump into the integration now with Angular and kind of show how that actually integrates with Kendo UI. there's a URL that you can go to called labs.kendoui.com. And what we have here is basically a site that we've set up for customers who are asking to implement Kendo UI with other frameworks. From our support model perspective, we support Kendo UI, obviously, but we can't support the entire matrix of permutations that occur when you combine Kendo UI with X, Kendo UI with Y, Kendo UI with Z. And so what we do is we basically say, look, we're not going to offer support. What we are going to do is open up a labs project. And the intention there is basically to just try and get some basic implementations working for some of these things you want. So we get a lot of questions about integration between Backbone and Kendo. We get Knockout as well. Breeze is another JavaScript framework as well. The one that you guys are probably interested in is Angular. And we have a repo for that as well. And so all these are basically bindings to those frameworks. It's basically leveraging the UI of Kendo UI with the underpinnings of these frameworks like Angular, like Polymer, like Ember, etc., and combining them to Goo. It's kind of like peanut butter and chocolate, you know, coming together, if you will. Maybe you don't like that flavor. That's fine. We have other flavors as well. So talking about Angular integration with Kendo, the way that this is done is through an entire set of directives. So the way that this operates is we have a whole slew of directives that you can use to turn Kendo UI or turn basic element structures into Kendo UI widgets using Angular. So this is the repo for it, and there's a pretty good site that kind of walks through this. It's off the repo site itself. So this is just using GitHub Pages for it. But basically, we walk you through how this all kind of hangs together. And I can't type fast enough, so I'll just highlight how this all kind of works. So the way this works is you take some script dependencies. The two that you'll typically use in the Kendo UI sense are obviously jQuery and Kendo. You'll take a dependency on Angular, the base library, and then you'll take a dependency on this library called Angular Kendo.js. With those four in place, you now have the ability of passing a set of utilizing the directives we have within defined within that library, and then use them within the context of your application. So here's an example. So to create a basic drop-down list control, which is a widget in Kendo UI, once you've made that declaration, you simply annotate the markup with this directive, Kendo drop-down list. So this is a little bit easier than the notation you typically see in Kendo UI. This is a very common pattern that you'll see in Kendo UI. So if I wanted to take this I'll do the exact same equivalent here. So if this wanted to drop down, say if I wanted to make this a list of countries, I could put an input, or rather a select tag. The way I would turn this into a drop-down list in the strict Kendo UI sense is I would use a query selector, and then I would initialize it calling Kendo drop-down list, and then giving it a list of attribute value pairs that would initialize that element. And of course, I would have to wrap this inside of a document on ready or on load. The way in which you can do that is you can do a short-term expression with jQuery, which is $ready. But with Angular, you can simplify the syntax a little bit simply by using the directive. So that's an example with the support for drop-down list, obviously. Another example is using any configuration attributes on the widget itself. So configuration attributes are those that are defined inline here. So if you go to our demo site for Kendo UI and we go to the drop-down list, you can see we have this API. This API really should be named like API plus configuration because there's a whole bunch of things that we can do against this. If you take a look at the initialization of a drop-down list, there's not really too many defined there. But you have a bunch of values you can define as part of this. It's actually in the documentation. There's a whole bunch of values that you can set that will define how the widget operates. So these are underneath the configuration here. So these are all various attribute value pairs that you can set. Some of these are not very useful, like animation. Auto binding is important and things like that. And now how these propagate is it looks like this. So this is basically how you initialize it. On the Angular side, you can do this using the k-dash property values that you have built into our library. So we initialize using Angular, the Angular library. We initialize this by annotating the element with Kendo drop-down list, and then we use these prefixed attribute value pairs with a k-dash. So we say k-dash, and then we give it a set of attribute value pairs for initializing the widget. So what we're doing here is we're giving a declarative way of initializing our UI components versus the explicit way, which is in JavaScript. Let's take a look at one more example so it's clear. So in this instance here, we have a controller here that we've defined. And the controller itself allows me to define a whole host of entity value pairs that I want to use to configure this UI widget. So if I want to create, again, a drop-down list, I can go ahead and revert to the controller. Sorry, it's not scrolling as well as I'd like. I can revert to the controller here, and the controller will give me an ability to annotate the scope with the options for the things that I wish to initialize. So things like the data source itself, which is a primitive as part of Kendo UI for doing data binding and retrieving data, for initializing values on the drop-down list, for specifying certain things like the option that will show up when it's not selected, this thing here. So those are various items that we can do for doing that. Binding to events is very similar. So events are, you can specify events at the markup level. So that's what we do here. So on change event, then we have this, this handler here for that event. And then we can define that as part of the scope through this Angular library, as you see here. So all we're doing is we're just writing out to the console what was selected by the user when this item changes. So there's a whole bunch of other integration that you can take a look at. So integration with Angular models. So the idea is that I can actually notify change events from widgets and then notify any bound models to them. So here's the classic ng dash expression for a model that I wish to update. And this is bound to a selected item here. So you can see that that's actually propagated here. So this library, Angular Kendo UI, is not finished. We still have a little bit of work to do, but it is there for you to use. You should probably be able to get to 90% of what you need, or even 100% if you don't use it all. There might be some edge cases you may encounter for that integration, but it is there for you to use.
How much of a priority is it?
It's actually gotten to the point now where we've gotten so many customer requests for it that we're actually considering making it officially supported. I don't know where we're at in terms of that final decision. I know that Burke's working hard on it, and that he's written extensively about it. There's a site called flippingawesome.org, which is just a community-based site. Burke wrote an article on this site describing our motivations for implementing Angular directives for Kendo UI, and goes into just how much work there was to do this. Because when you write an Angular directive for a UI framework, you have to consider the fact that you're basically providing a different way of initializing part of your framework, which means you have to implement everything that we do and bring it along for the ride. And so if you read through this article that Burke wrote, he talks a little bit about how, on the surface, it looks easy to declare these widgets. But then once you start looking at the nuances of getting it working from a 100% feature complete level, you start to build a lot of infrastructure just to get that implementation working. Now, Burke in his article talks about how he found a shortcut. He was able to find a way in which to propagate, rather than declaring a explicit directive for every widget, and we have like over 40 different widgets. He was able to find a shorthand notation for a clever little trick to get that working over. But he does talk a little bit about how building your own directives is hard. You have to think about many different things. There are many competing concerns. So it's definitely worthwhile checking out. So that's the article. It was just recently published, so you can check that out. So that's one way in which we integrate with a framework. There are other means as well. You can see some examples of this. We have a very, very primitive implementation for Polymer. We have a linter. So just as much as there's a linter for JavaScript, we have a linter for Kendo UI that you can use to check whether or not you're structuring your prototypes and your property value pairs correctly. The reason why you may want to do this is if you have any experience with Kendo UI, you may notice that if you don't configure something exactly correct, what happens is nothing gets displayed on the screen. So that's not entirely like useful. And nothing gets projected to the console. Like nothing, like literally nothing happens. And you're just stuck there like saying, what happened? So the linter will help you check just to see if you're smoking something before you hit F5 in your browser. We are working on a tool, which I'll show you, which is a Chrome DevTool extension. You can see it here. We haven't publicly announced this yet, so despite the fact I'm being recorded, please don't share this with anyone. But basically, the Chrome DevTools are great because they can be extended. There's a great Chrome DevTool if you're using Knockout, I would recommend as well. There's a bunch of other ones. But what this will do is it will scan the DOM and detect whether or not you have any widgets on your page, any Kendo UI widgets. So let me just scroll back here, go to the demos page for Kendo UI. And then what it will do is it will tell you what version of Kendo UI you're running, what widgets are on the page, and how they're configured. So you can discern whether or not you're doing the thing you were thinking you wanted to do. So I'll go into a demo here for autocomplete. Apparently it's not being used. It is buggy, so just bear with me for a second. Just kick it again. There you go. So you can see we have these widgets on the page here. They're denoted by the following ID. And if you click on one of those, so the autocomplete one, you get a list of its options. The thing you have to remember about these UI frameworks is that it's not just what you declare, it's also what you don't declare, right? Remember, a lot of these UI frameworks are going based on convention. Right? There's this whole argument of convention versus configuration. The same idea applies to JavaScript. There are a lot of UI frameworks, like you may have heard this over and over again as you look at MVC, conventions versus configuration. The idea there is that there should be an assumed set of defaults that you can just use. And the reason why is because configuration can be gnarly, right? If I had to configure every single thing that I need to use in MVC, you have these just huge whatever, XML, JSON-based files for configuring everything. So just assume some defaults. UI frameworks work the exact same way. So we assume some defaults here that are set. And oftentimes, a tool like this will show you what those defaults are. So that turns out to be incredibly useful. All of our widgets emit events as well. And that any UI framework worth its salt will definitely emit events as well. So as I'm doing certain operations in here, so for example, typing, you'll notice that we get a bunch of events that propagate to this window. These are simply just being surfaced up through the tool itself. But these are things that you can subscribe to. Again, any UI framework that you will use on the front end should have events associated with it. Subscribing to those events and emitting them to the console, for example, would be a useful way of doing that. And then we have diagnostics for, this is the linter. So I told you about the linter here. So the linter will check whether certain values are set correctly. So definitely worth noting. All right. As I said before, this is not unique to Kendo UI. In fact, we borrow just a lot of the ideas that are out on the web today to support our customers. So if you're using Angular today, there are Angular tools. There are Angular tools for Chrome. If you're using Ember, there are Ember tools. If you're using Knockout, there are Knockout tools. Some are better than others, but definitely worth checking out. It is incumbent upon you to use these things, and don't worry if you feel like you have that imposter syndrome because you're using them. All of us use them. Even the people who wrote wrote the frameworks, use the tools. So don't feel bad, you know? So use the tools. That's why we use them. Okay, so just getting back to the list here. One other thing you guys want to talk about is our server helpers.
So can I jump back?
Yeah.
Did you say that there is already a linter for Kendo?
Yes.
Where was that?
That was on our labs project page. So if you go to labs.kendoui.com, this is basically where we're putting a lot of our open source stuff and things that are interesting. If you scroll down just a little bit, there's our linter tool right there. So Kendo lint. We also have a Vim extension for those of you who are, you know, Vim folks.
That one client.
Not, what? What's that? Yeah, exactly. I wrote a series of just code templates for Kendo. You know, there's any number of IDEs. We probably could do a better job on the Visual Studio side, but yeah, it's just one of those things. We do have a project called Kendo Bootstrapper as well, not us, but the open source project. This was written by one of our engineers, and it's basically a way of constructing a project from scratch quickly and easily that uses Kendo. So basically, it's a command line tool that you'll run. It uses some dependencies like Node, npm obviously, and Google Chrome for getting started. But the idea there is if you're creating a new project and you want to just get started quickly, the Bootstrapper will go ahead and provide that implementation for you. So Bootstrappers are very common in the web dev space. I don't know if you guys have heard of them before. Boilerplates are another term to describe them. There's the HTML5 boilerplate, which is at h5bp.com. This one is actually implemented within Visual Studio through the Visual Studio Gallery. So you can go to the Visual Studio Gallery and download this for Visual Studio. This is basically a way of saying, you know, file new project in Visual Studio. It's the exact same thing. It's just basically get me started at a starting point. So there's one for HTML5, there's one for Kendo, there's ones for others as well. And there are tools that will complement them. In the web dev space, a lot of them are done off the command line. So just be aware of that. For this one, which is a good starting reference for this, there's a tool called Initializer, which allows you to pick and choose the libraries you want to use. So this is something I'd recommend. So you can say, I want to use Bootstrap. I want to use, remember I talked about polyfills. These are maybe some of the polyfills I want to use. I can add certain capabilities to my existing site. So I can add things like IE classes. You guys know what IE classes are? They're like they're conditional statements you put in your markup for IE only that will parse those statements on the IE side. And they're usually done for doc type declarations. So doc type declaration is the thing you'll first see at the top of your page. Those things matter in certain cases. Chrome Frame is basically putting the Chrome rendering engine into IE. Google Analytics integration, htaccess for Apache, Fave icons, human.txt, 404s, etc. As you're working with these, some things might come into play, like CORS. Have you guys done anything with cross-domain access with CORS? That's something you'll need to know, especially if you're writing APIs. Are you guys doing any API writing at all? So, yeah, if you guys are doing anything with that, you're going to want to know about CORS. So CORS is also known as cross-origin resource sharing, and it's basically a means of declaring where certain requests can come from. So by design, browsers like Chrome will not allow you to go to a different domain for a callback. In a lot of cases, you have to call back to the originating domain which the page came from. So if I came from foo.com, my page was served up by foo.com, I cannot do in certain cases, a remote call unless otherwise specified to bar.com. And that's controlled by the server. The server itself will tell you whether or not I can do that. And what does that is CORS. So if you guys are writing anything with Web API today, are you guys doing anything with Web API? If you guys are writing your own controllers and action methods and Web API, et cetera, you're going to want to know about CORS, because unless the only consumer of your API is yourself, you're going to have to enable this feature in order for people to reach you. Okay, so definitely worth noting. There's a site you can go to called Enable CORS. I know I'm just blasting with you a lot of information. I apologize, but you know it's on the video, and I'll give you just more. But I like kind of going all over the place because it kind of dovetails into everything.
I'm going to put all of the links. If you're crazily writing down links, I'm actually getting all the links that John puts up, and I'm going to put them all on the internet.
Yeah. So,
you don't need to crazily write questions. I've got you covered.
okay, no worries.
Thank you.
What if you miss one?
Don't worry. I'm covering the base common denominator for all you guys. Like, I don't know what you're building, but I do know that these are common design patterns I see with web developers today, like doing APIs, implementing cores, doing UI frameworks, integrating frameworks, etc. These are, what you guys are doing is great because it's what we all do right now. So there's a site you can go to called enablecores.org, which will walk you through the steps of how to do this. And if you don't do this, you're going to hit it hard when your app breaks in the browser. The best way to determine whether or not you're doing it correctly is just to run the app, and if nothing happens, if the AJAX calls fails, and you see this big warning in Chrome that's written in red saying cross-domain access not enabled, or it will often say not allows only same origin, then you know it's not working. You need to turn it on. In older versions of IE, nothing happens. The AJAX call just fails for no reason. You know, it's just awesome. So yeah, just one of those things to be mindful of. There's other things that we're looking at, just to finish off on the Kendo side, there's other things that we're looking at the moment. Have you guys done anything with Signal R yet?
Not yet.
Okay, Signal R is awesome. There are things like WebSockets in Signal R which allow you to do push notifications to the client from the server. And one of the things we're looking at doing, which is on our roadmap, is providing a facility to do just that. So we're calling it a real-time data source. So the idea is, in Kendo UI, we have this object called a data source. If you've done anything with .NET, it's kind of like a data set, except not as shitty. Data set is like verboten. If you ever mention a .NET, if you ever go to a .NET conference and you say, I like data sets, they'll just like march you out. But it's kind of like a data set. It's an in-memory structure and preserves changes. So that kind of sounds like a data set. It has data sets were kind of like that. But one of the things but it's not heavy. Like our data source isn't as heavy as a data set. We don't serialize XML like a data set does and all that garbage. But one of the things we're doing is we're looking at integrating with frameworks like SignalR, Socket.io, backend with WebSockets. And what it would allow you to do is basically have a page where if you're connected in that manner, you'll just see updates propagating on the client side. This is a really effective way of doing this in an architectural perspective. You may think about what are the scenarios where I want to do real-time updates. Notifications of saves on the server. So for example, if you're writing an application that is a word processor, right? You're like typing, you don't get the user to click Control S or anything like that. It just saves automatically, right? You could actually trigger that as an update. That when the server is committed to the database, it could send an update back to the client, to the connected client, and say, I was able to commit. Typically that was done via round trip, but it's another way of doing it. Another way is like chat window, like a chat application would be a way of doing this as well. So push notifications in that manner.
Toast.
Yep.
You ever had a toast on your phone?
Yep.
Gee, it's cool if they can tell me that without having me have to.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's great. Again, I'm going to jump around here. Have you guys done anything with Glimpse yet? The tool?
Guys have installed it, but we haven't.
Awesome. Well, at least you've done the install. So like this is where like this all ties in together. Like trust me, I'm not just going random. This all ties in together. There's a great diagnostic tool. If you're not using it, you have to install it. If you're doing anything with ASP.NET today, you have to use this tool. It's called Glimpse. It's by Anthony and Nick. Anthony's Aussie. He used to live in Brisbane. He now lives in New York. Yeah, he moved. He moved last year. Yeah, it's all right. Great guys. And this is like Firebug for the server. So oftentimes you want to figure out what your routes are resolving to, or what your controllers are doing, or a whole host of other things. This is what Glimpse will provide. So Glimpse will provide all of this stuff. The reason why I mention this in the context of client notifications is because they have support for client notifications in Glimpse now. There's actually some really cool stuff that they've added in Glimpse that supports this. And there's a great example. I want to make sure that it's updated. Oh, come on, you. Let me just see if I can get the URL. There's a public demo they have that that shows this off, and they never publish the URL. I keep telling Anthony you should publish the URL. The only thing they have is a screenshot. To install it, you have to go through all this bullshit. But they have a website that is the music store website, and just let me do this for a second. Just bear with me for 1 second. They support web forms now. Yeah, that was back in the day. Shoot. Well, this is the latest update they did last month. So they can do client-side updates within Glimpse. And here's what it looks like. So on the right-hand side, they have this section here for Ajax, history, and PubSub in the tool. And then they propagate those changes into a summary listing that you see here. So this is a must-have tool if you're doing anything with ASP.NET. It's great for client-side dev work. I wrote an extension point for Sitefinity. It's very easy to extend. So this is just me being a jerk. So I wrote this tool. We have a CMS called Sitefinity, and so I wrote this tool that integrates with Sitefinity here. And so if you're working with Angular or any of these other tools that may not have a Glimpse extension, this might be a useful project, side project, if you're wanting to learn how to use these frameworks and integrate it with Glimpse. So definitely worth checking out from that angle.
What did you use to do that Twitter search?
Oh, just go to search.twitter.com. Yeah, search.twitter.com, and then search Twitter wherever you want. There was a new project that was announced today called Helios. I don't know if you guys saw this for ASP.NET. This is basically, the ASP.NET team is trying to separate the infrastructure of ASP.NET from system.web. And this was announced this morning. Not to confuse you anymore, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned it because I saw it on Twitter. That's why I mentioned. See, everything just ties in. You mentioned Twitter search. I'm like, I remember something I saw on Twitter. So, yeah. So Helios is basically a way of. There's a lot of stuff that's coming out of the web dev team at Microsoft. So SignalR, Web API, etc. They can't iterate fast enough because of this dependency they have on system.web. System.web provides a huge amount of infrastructure. It's so big, the DLL itself is like 4 megs. It's an enormous library. And it provides everything from authentication to authorization to all of the API providers, everything that's built into a lot of the stuff that you saw introduced in ASP.NET Web 2.0. Web Forms is in there to a certain extent. There's just a lot of stuff that tied in there. The problem is that Microsoft can only ship a new iteration or a new update every 3 years. So they've gone to a 1-year iteration now, but they're very slow because the amount of infrastructure that's built on ASP.NET is massive. So what Helios is an attempt to provide a ASP.NET runtime without that dependency on system.web. And so they'll be able to iterate faster on top of it. This was announced this morning, so just something I wanted to mention because you mentioned Twitter search and that immediately triggered, aha, I remember, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not just going off in every crazy direction, but it is something to be a note of. So coming back now, we're unwinding the stack. If you ever done anything with recursion, we're not doing a Stack Overflow here. We're unwinding the stack. We're going to come back. So I mentioned, I mentioned real-time data source that led to Glimpse, which led to Twitter, which led to et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, so we're winding the stack back. Got our boilerplate, got the linter, Kendo UI, et cetera, and then we came back here, and this is where we talked about server helpers. Awesome. So, just update the list here briefly. So we covered these two. We sort of kind of covered this a little bit, but not really. We covered this. Customizing Bootstrap. Okay, let's talk about that. I'll talk about that next, and we'll talk about the other ones soon. This one I definitely did cover. So these are the 3 left. jQuery I'll just talk about in context for these 2 other ones. Customizing Bootstrap. So there's a huge industry built around this that if you just do a search for Bootstrap themes, there's any number of designers who are building themes for Bootstrap right now. Bootstrap is not terribly hard to customize. I mean, the classes that are defined as part of Bootstrap are well known. Even down to the pixel dimensions, like they're really, really well understood. And even to that point, I mean, there are a number of themes that you can use. We provide one for Kendo UI. So if you go to back to Kendo UI, I just want to make sure that you guys see this. We ship a bunch of themes as part of Kendo UI, and so you can see we have all these themes. We have one for Bootstrap, which is here. And if you want, you can use what's called our theme builder. And our theme builder will allow you to basically get a sense of what these themes look like when they're enacted. But you can also customize them. So you can actually customize the CSS through what's called the theme builder here. If you've ever used jQuery UI, it's called the theme roller. It's very similar. The idea is you just take the CSS that is defined and you change it. So Valentine's Day was recently here, so we'll change the background color to red, and that's the change, right? It's just CSS. And then the CSS that's generated is here. So all of our classes are prefixed with K-. So in terms of Bootstrap, if we take a look at the CSS for Bootstrap itself, they're well defined and understood, so you can override them. That's the nature of CSS. The fact that it's called cascading, it's intentionally called cascading style sheets because they cascade. So you can define Bootstrap at the top and then define your own underneath. And they talk about how these ones are defined in lines. So you may see a reference to things that may not make sense to you. There's this CSS file called normalized CSS. Do you guys know what this is? It's a reset. So basically, it's basically there is basically to reset the browser in a way so that everything looks the same. Because the reality is that because of things like status bars and scroll bars and default assumptions made by various browsers, we can't start from a starting place in CSS without a reset. CSS resets were invented way back, and they were invented in order to give us a common look and feel from a CSS perspective that we could all start from. And so you'll use these CSS resets, like normalize, like CSS reset.css, to do that. And Bootstrap is no different. It uses one as well, so that it looks consistent across every browser. Because if they didn't do a reset, the assumptions would be there's a status bar and things like that, and things would be misaligned. So as you alt-tab from one browser to the other, they would look different. So they use the CSS reset. The grid systems themselves are totally easy to figure out. They're basically defined as on divs, and you use this notation like .row or .col for rows and columns, and then they lay it out accordingly. They have a set number of CSS queries defined for different. You can embed them within media queries. Have you guys covered media queries yet? Yes? No? You guys, you have no idea what you're getting into. it's like this avalanche of information. Sorry.
Are we really targeting mobile that much?
But this isn't just mobile. This is responsive web dev as well.
It is responsive.
Yes. 10-second, if you're at a CSS conference or a cocktail party, you don't want to embarrass yourself, this is the definition. This is the one I use. Media queries are like if-then-else statements for CSS. And you might wonder, what does that mean? The term media query means to query media. What media? Things like the screen, your viewport, the device, the type of device it's running off of. More often than not, the color spectrum that is supported by the viewport, more often than not, people will use media queries simply for dimensions. And so the reason why that's relevant is because as you're using grid systems, if you're targeting responsive web design or RWD, you're going to want to use a responsive grid system that will grow or contract based on the dimensions, whether you go from a small screen on a device or to a large screen on a desktop. You'll use a grid system, and then you'll use media queries to determine how those things flow. So media query will say, these set of rules apply to when the dimensions are this big. These set of rules apply to when the dimensions are this big. That's media queries, more or less. Okay? So if you see these statements in your CSS at media, that's a media query. And what this is saying, I'll show you an example here. What this is saying is if they have a screen declaration here, but you can basically see here that like if your screen is width is 276 pixels or more, that means min width here, use these rules that are defined in here at a CSS level. These are in CSS. This is not JavaScript. This is CSS. And then Bootstrap itself has these criteria for the different media queries. So if you want to customize Bootstrap, you have to understand media queries because they will be relevant to the types of screens that you do. And this is how they talk about their grid system. So when you use Bootstrap for grids, this is how they show how they grow and contract. And they can show, you know, how they adjust based off that. So this page here is using the Bootstrap grid system, right? So as I grow and contract this, notice how these things flow. So they convert from cross 4 cells, so that's that call mid 4. If I contract it down, it switches to call mid 1. That's based off the media queries that are executing in context. In fact, you can, if you don't believe me, you can take a look at the source, do a search. Just go ahead and say view source. Not there. Sorry, I get confused sometimes with Windows, and I hit Control F when I meant to say Apple F. So there, this is going to be confusing because this is the docs, but you can take a look at the media queries for that as well. So customizing Bootstrap is its own sort of thing. There are a number of ways to do it. They define some defaults, but you can override these. At the end of the day, one of the ways in which you can do this is just to, you know, import all your own rules. And if you don't get that joke, you haven't done enough CSS. But basically what this is basically a massive override. So this is basically like, this is the one rule to rule them all at a CSS level. So if you put your rules down, you decorate with this bang important descriptor. It basically says, forget what you knew before, use this one. This is the truth. So that's why it's a bit of a joke. So anyways, no one laughed, so there you go. So yeah, they have all these various things that you can do for customizing Bootstrap. Don't spend a lot of time on worrying about the nuances of Bootstrap. My recommendation to you is UI at the end of the day is really just a means of communicating, you know, your intentions. It doesn't matter if the button is blue versus green. Sometimes it does. But that's the thing that's a low priority item. You know, get the functionality working, worry about the design afterwards. Believe me, I've implemented enough systems to know that designers can make anything look good. And they will do so very effectively. And there's the old saying goes, you can't put lipstick on a turd, but you can roll it in glitter. So you might as well do that. So you might as well do that if you're going to do that from a designer perspective. Don't worry about the designer, just get the implementation working. Get to know grids and get to know frameworks like Bootstrap. They are important, they are useful.
I've been running SSW for 20 years. I've also been a lecturer at the University of Technology, Sydney for many years, and I think the gap is getting wider between what they're being taught and what employers need for the guys to hit the ground running and be able to do real work.
Looking for a job as a junior developer can be really tough. There are so many applicants out there, and it's really hard for an employer to separate one from the other. They try really hard, but it's a challenge for them.
One of the problems when you come out of university is everything you learn at university isn't directly transferable into the enterprise.
I think I've seen all the problems that companies are having with new recruits. That's why we created Bootcamp.
The Bootcamp is a place where you'll go for 9 weeks, 40 to 60 hours a week, and do one thing and one thing only. That is learn to code in Microsoft technologies.
You're going to be learning MVC5, HTML5. These technologies are really important because the uptake in the industry is huge. So this course will just fill that gap between university and starting work.
At the Bootcamp, you have a mentor, and that mentor gets you over a challenge you may have straight away, so you can go on to the next challenge. Instead of sitting there for hours searching Google and trying to find answers that sometimes you just can't find.
It's important to have a mentor because it stops you going off track. It stops you getting stuck on things that aren't really important. It happens time and time again where people are going through things that they found on the internet.
What they really need is experience and hands-on coding. And this boot camp is going to give people the hands-on experience in coding for 9 weeks. Because if you can do as opposed to learn, you have your best chance at getting job ready for your first job in the industry.
It's not an easy course. For 9 weeks, you're thrown into the fire. You live and breathe .NET code. You live and breathe learning best practices and working as part of the team. You'll be working a minimum of 40 hours and mostly 60 hours a week, every week.
Becoming job ready is more than just learning how to write code. You need to know how to work in a team, you need to know how to gather requirements, you need to know how to use the tool set, the Microsoft stack of tools. And during the boot camp, we're going to be teaching you all these other aspects, the soft skills of development that, by yourself, learning from a book, learning through Google or videos, you just will never learn.
It's not